Patty, Edwina Romero. Edwina Romero is the author of 3 books about Las Vegas, Nevada, New Mexico history. This is her first novel. Born in East Boston, Massachusetts, she has lived in New Mexico for over 30 years and now splits her writing time between Las Vegas and Long Beach, California.
Thank you, Mary. And you didn't want to say something about the salon?
I'm gonna do that after you're done.
Oh, no, okay. Well, I just want to welcome everybody to the Las Vegas Literary Salon. And this salon talk, which is about reading and writing historical fiction. And I thank you, Mary, for the introduction. And I welcome you all. And thank you for coming. And big smiles all around, I hope. I want to start out by saying I love reading historical fiction. And I feel honored that I actually finished a book with much help of historical fiction. And so I'm hoping that all of you are the same, and that's why you're here, that you're interested at least in historical fiction, maybe not loving it, but you will by the end of the day. Let me put it that way. Okay, so just by a little show of hands, and because I'm not used to this Zoom thing, so I'm an old-fashioned teacher. So how many people just read historical fiction and not really want to write it or anything like that? Okay, so we have some solo readers, we'll call you. Thank you. And how many do both, read it and write it? One, just one, and me. And Yasmin Turner. Okay. Yep. All right, so we have a couple of writers as well. How many people want to write historical fiction? Okay. Well, we have aspirations as well. Okay. To minimize any confusion, let's talk about a definition. You know, in argumentation, you always define your terms. I'd hope we don't have an argument, but it might come up. But for primarily a historical fiction, and it has some kind of subgenres too, historical fiction, romance. Many people think of it as strictly romance novels, and historical mystery fiction. So we'll talk about those maybe not, but I'll give you a definition that came from a workshop with Margaret Atwood. I wasn't there, but I just got the definition from her. She says historical fiction is a literary genre where the story takes place in the past, and I would add that the stories take place in the past of when it's written. The past is a vast country, and so we'll look at it that way. That's, you know, from the writer's perspective, it's past, whatever they're writing about. And the historical novels capture details of the time period accurately as accurately as possible for authenticity. That's one really, I think, important ingredient, is that the historical aspects, really, you want to make them as authentic as possible. And when you're reading, you hope they are authentic. I always do. And I have certain favorite authors, or rather favorite books, I should say, where they do just that. Everything feels right. You are in that past period, no matter what it is. She goes on to say that many novels in this genre tell fictional stories that involve actual historical figures or historical events. And most of them do. I don't know of any that don't. And generally speaking, historical figures are right there alongside of the imaginary characters that the authors invent and put into those places. The authenticity also includes what social norms of the time are, and manners and customs, traditions, clothing, all of the accoutrements of a story. And I would like to say, further point out that sometimes it isn't quite rich enough, the historical aspects. I have read books that have told me it takes place in, 1942, and that was the end of it. And I just had to believe it took place in 1942. What's really fun about historical writing for me is to be put into a past time, a time when things were all different from what they are to me today, because that's when I really get out of my life and go into a different place when I'm reading. And I really expect that from my pleasure reading. So we have some questions, I believe,
Yeah.
already. But
Yes.
before we go into the questions, I would like to say to everybody, I would like to ask you, do you have questions about historical fiction in general? And we'll talk about that more, the general issues of history. Yeah, Sharon.
Two things. One, if you have a question, you can either click on your raise hand icon in the in that bar down there, or you can just raise your hand and I will acknowledge you. But I do have a question. And
Okay.
my question is, how much research did you do for Prairie Madness?
Oh, God.
Okay. Well, that leads me to this, that today's talk, as I said, I love reading historical fiction, and I wrote a historical fiction novel, mystery, by the way. And so I'm going to use that novel as a kind of a guinea pig, sort of, that we could take it apart and look at what makes it historical fiction. So would you repeat and it's called Prairie Madness, Conspiracy at Fort Union. I'd hold up the book, but I don't know, is it backwards to you?
No,
Oh,
no,
it
it
does
is.
show.
No.
Okay. All right.
Mary held it up.
Pardon me?
Mary
Oh,
held it up.
Mary Rose is holding it up. Okay. Because in it's backwards, like I'm in a mirror. So thank you for holding it up, Mary. Okay, so let's
The
see.
question was,
The question again.
how much research did you do for
Okay.
Prairie Madness?
Great, because I get to tell my story now. My story begins for Prairie Madness in 1982. 1982. The book takes place in 1881. And I'll read you just a few things from the back. Those of you who haven't read it can be situated in the time frame of this historical novel. April 1881, Fort Union, New Mexico Territory. A drought-filled spring, the soldiers are restless and bored, garrison buildings are deteriorating, and the ever-present winds wear down the mind. There's talk of prairie madness, a condition leading to depression and violence. Now, obviously, I needed to do some research to find out just what I wrote, that the buildings were deteriorating, for one thing. So why did the research begin like 1982, which was way before? Well, the research began when I started working with the Las Vegas Players, which was an amateur theater group that organized in 1982, and I did PR for them. So I did some research because I wanted to see if there were any amateur theater groups 100 years before our first performance in 1982. And indeed there were. There were not only a few, there were many, and there were some at Fort Union. This was the beginning, this was the embryo maybe of my interest in writing a book about Fort Union and the amateur theater groups at Fort Union. So it started way back then in 1982, and mostly it just kind of stopped once I did that. And I was a student, I was a graduate student. My daughter was 8 years old, and there was a whole life around me, and so I had to stop writing for pleasure. I kept reading though for pleasure. And over the years, I did research later to expand the information about the amateur theater groups, because I was writing an article for El Palacio magazine in Santa Fe. And that article turned into another book, which I don't know if Mary has, but I'm holding it up backwards to show you that it's Footlights in the Foothills. And it's about amateur theater groups in Las Vegas and in Fort Union, beginning 1871 to 1890 something, 99. Okay. And so I did more research for that. And that's when I began to find things about Fort Union and about the people that were, the soldiers were all, soldiers made up the amateur groups, and they did all the performances were done by soldiers. Male and female parts were done by the soldiers. And it must have been just one big hilarity, I think, to think. And they were always comedies. And one little thing in my research just kind of clicked with me. They mentioned one of the actors, Flannery, the very life and soul of the comedy company, was the quote in the newspaper. The research covered newspapers and anything I could find on Fort Union at that time. And it also revealed, as I did the more and more research I did, the story, basically research really perpetuates itself. For me, it just gives me more things to research all the time. And I wanted to, and so during this research to expand it, and I came across this character Flannery, and he was a sergeant. And I did more research through looking at, I read basically Leo Oliva's Fort Union and the Frontier Soldier, Frontier Army rather. And in his book, he tells you all about the social life of Fort Union, about the amateur groups that started up and performed and stopped and so forth. And then and I also found it in this wonderful little book that I think is out of print now, called Fort Union. It's backwards. I'm so sorry. Fort Union, a photo history.
Let me tell you, it's backwards to you, but it's not backwards to us.
Oh, you guys can read it. Oh, great. It's Fort Union, a photo history. And there's a little story in here about a Fort Union couple. And you might, if you have the book, you recognize her picture. There's a picture of her in the book. And she is actually Bridget Malloy, and she fell in love with a sergeant called Sergeant Cloonan. And so when I came across this couple, I thought, oh my God, these are real people. These are people that want to get married. She's a laundress and he's a sergeant. They had to get permission from all the way up the ranks, the echelons, just to get married. And she was a laundress. And so I think I'm getting away from the question now. But anyway, I thought now I'm getting these characters and this research, and I don't know what to do with it, but I've got all the information. So the research went on and on and on, and it still goes on back and forth when I'm writing the book, as I'm writing the book. I'd say the research is really self-perpetuating, and I love it. It's so much fun. Does that answer your question, Sharon?
Thank you.
Okay.
It answered my other question too, I think. My next question was, where did the idea originate?
Oh, yes.
Minutes, but I can see it kind of emerged from the whole research process.
Exactly. And that's what's so exciting, I think, about writing and reading, well, writing for sure, historical fiction, is that the stories are there. And each story, and the stories you find, then they multiply. There are more stories that can be they blossom out of those stories. And I just couldn't stop writing about them. Yeah.
Does anyone else have a question for Patty? David?
Yeah, I do. You know, Patty, there's so much about your book. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, but we lost you for a second. Yeah.
Okay, so anyway, there's so much about the book that I really love. but it was about the characters, especially how you developed them and the picture that I got of them. They're really distinct people that I could sort of relate to between, Olivia and the sheriff and uh, I forgot his name. Anyway, and the bad guy, Foot, and Shiny. But basically, most of all, is Mary Margaret, right? And what makes her, I think, come alive to me is this brogue that she uses, when she's talking to Sean in her mind, right?
Mhm.
And I think it's just so perfect. So my question actually, is very endearing. So it has a whole different feel to Mary Margaret after a while. So my question is actually, you've told me that most creative writing teaches, they kind of tell you not to use dialect, not to use brogue, anything like that. It
Mhm.
just doesn't work. So you went aside from that, obviously, and did it. So what made you do it in the first place? And then secondly, did you actually hear this brogue when you were in East Boston, with your Irish part of your family or in the streets? Or did you just make it up? I don't know.
Okay, well, thanks for the questions. I'll try to take them one at a time. When I did the research, part of the research was discovering how many Irish immigrants ended up at Fort Union. And they were not just soldiers, but most of them were, of course. The soldiers were there, and they would get off the boat from Ireland in New York and be conscripted right on the dock, and then shipped out to the West. And so they were all young guys. I mean, of course, they wouldn't be conscripting old guys, but they were all young, and they didn't know where they were going. They had no idea how big this country was, and they all had an Irish brogue. We know that, if they even spoke English, But as far as Mary Margaret herself is concerned, I couldn't envision her any other way. And a lot of the writing is research, but a lot of it is also, I had to do a lot of free writing and timed writings to develop the feelings of the people and the feelings of an immigrant going across this vast country, ending up in a place like Fort Union, which is so unlike Ireland, lush and green and wonderful, and they come here and it's very different to be in the fort. I mean, and the descriptions of the fort are in the book. There's a lot of that in the book, but for Mary Margaret, it just was no other way to talk. I didn't think she had any other way to talk. And she makes fun of Sean because she thinks he's got a brogue, and she doesn't. And so, she works very hard to try and get rid of her brogue. She wants to be American. But as far as how I created the brogue, I think it's great, and I'm so glad that people enjoy it. It's true. I've been in creative writing classes. I've been a student. I've taught them as well. I don't say this to my students, but all the creative writing classes I took throughout college, the instructors really made it very important not to use dialect. They felt that it turns people off, that it's not artistic. Well, it wasn't easy to do that dialect, but I unfortunately know my grandparents did not speak with brogue. I wish they had. But I will have to admit, I used movies and I read books. Edna O'Brien, a couple of her books, she writes in the dialect. And so, and I copied, that's all I could do. But after a while, I heard it in my head, only in relationship with Mary Margaret herself. Even her friend Olivia does not have a brogue. She's teaching Mary Margaret to speak and be American. But I hope Mary Margaret never does become completely American, because I think the brogue also kind of reflects her spunk, if I can use that word. It kind of, without it, I don't know that she could be as forceful in my mind as a character. So
two things. One is David Rogers has a question, but first, do you think being an actress, because you have done some acting, that kind of contributes to your ability to kind of internalize that character enough that you can speak as though you were that character?
Yeah, well, that's a really good point. You know, I hadn't thought about it. I've never acted in a brogue, but I did act, and I did have that experience of trying to be inside someone else and speaking and performing like that person. So yeah, I think it did help. Yeah.
David?
I mean, this was a long time over time that I wrote this, you know, I mean, and it's years and years, although it came out in 2018, but you know, long before that, I was always writing and writing in free form and different forms and pulling it all together. And the story itself brought in more stories. And I'm just getting crazy. So what's David's question?
David Rogers.
Yes.
Well, the dialect thing, Mark Twain, it worked out pretty well for him and Huck Finn. So,
Oh, I would like to think we're in the same company.
Yeah, people told him, gave him a lot of garbage about writing dialect
well,
too back in the day.
There you go.
It's funny how that works. So
Yeah.
I was going to cut back to the research process. You talked about the beginning and middle. I wonder, assuming you have or do, when did you know you had enough? And
Yeah,
when,
that's
like,
a
to
good
quit,
question.
it's sort of
You
the
know.
artist dilemma. When do I finish the painting or the script or the research?
That's a good point, because you can go on researching forever. And sometimes when I'd get lost in the story, I would just get away from it and research something, just because I needed to research. But it was always back and forth. It was like writing, oh, I need this information, where can I find it? And researching, like, simple things like, what kind of brushes did the soldiers use to brush their shoes? Because at one point, or their boots, at one point in the book, a very lovable but important character does clean his boots, and so he's a soldier. And what did he use? Did he spit shine, or what did they use? So then I'd go back to research, and then I'd come back to the story and writing. At one point I came back, and I came back from research and kept writing and just kept writing. But eventually there was something that would have to lead me back into a book. And I didn't always find everything in books and newspapers and printed matter. Sometimes I found it at the fort itself. My very first research was going to the fort, was being there, walking up and down Suds Row, and seeing what was left was just the foundations of the laundresses' quarters. And they're very small, and they lived in the quarters and did the laundry in the quarters. And Mary Margaret, like my friend here, Bridget Malloy, Mary Margaret does all the laundry for Company B. And those things they have to be researched. It's not something And little bits of information would be at the fort. Then I'd come back and I'd do some more research and I have to say that the Google was a big help. Yeah, I could start with something like Army laundresses and found out that they were actually in the Army, the laundresses at Fort Union. That was a whole different thing. So I had to, include that into the book. So I never really stopped and said, that's enough, until I found the answer to some question that came up. That's enough of that. If no more questions came up, my research was done. That's how I felt, and it was complete.
Speaking of questions, Bob Hensler has one for you.
Bob, where's Bob? I have to look at you people. Oh, there's Bob. Okay, Bob. And there's a question down here. John Benziger has his hand up too. So let's go to Bob, and then we'll go down. We'll talk to you, John.
Well, first off, you talked about the brogue, and when I'm reading, I like to hear different voices. So a brogue, or whatever it is that your dialect or whatever you're using plays into your characters. So, you know, that Mark Twain got hammered about it a little bit. You felt a little guilt, I guess, a little bit about it, but that's not my question. My question goes to the polishing of the shoes, poetic license and the real thing. It happened. How did you take your poetic license, you know, with something like that and swing it into your book?
Well, you know, there were times when I couldn't find the answer. That no matter how I researched or where I went, and I didn't find the answer. And so you fictionalize, you know, you do your best you can, but I was so immersed in the history and the research that it wasn't that far off, and it is still fiction. Yeah, and I would come to that point where I say, well, wait a minute, it's not going to be nonfiction. So if he didn't, and in fact, I end with the polishing of the shoes. In fact, I never really got a conclusive answer and then I ended up emailing someone who was on the staff at a museum where they had these items. And he said, well, we're not sure that they used brushes. I thought to myself, well, if they're not sure, nobody else is going to be sure. And who's going to call me up and say, hey, they weren't using brushes at Fort Union in 1881? And I'll say, well, okay, then prove it. So, you know, your research, my research, you know, at some point you have to say, it's fiction.
John?
Okay.
John, yes, what's your question?
Hi.
Hi.
I really enjoyed reading the book. It was great.
Oh, thank you.
I was intrigued and continued to be intrigued about the settlements and the small towns that were sort of in the outskirts that
Yes.
ended up playing a part in the story.
Yes.
And I wasn't sure if all of them were based in fact and what happened to those settlements. And I'm just curious about sort of the non-fictional aspect of those locations.
Yes, thank you for asking that. Loma Parda, Lomapard, is real. It's still there, and it was notorious for gambling halls, whorehouses, and any kind of entertainment that you could conceive of, basically. And it doesn't do that anymore. It's just a village now. And Tiptonville was a real. Pardon me?
I said you
What'd
don't.
you say?
You said it wasn't never mind, I'm sorry.
Oh, I know. I said it with a Boston accent. I have a really hard time saying part of the. I can't roll my tongue around it. I'm sorry. But and Tiptonville is real. It's still there. Well, it's not really there, but you can find traces of it. Now, at the time in 1881, I believe Watros was La Junta, and it's where Three Rivers come together, and that's where that was another town that was in the area. I used, and of course, Las Vegas. I mean, they come to Las Vegas. It's after the railroad. I mean, they come on the train from time to time, and they come by wagon, and they perform in Las Vegas. The Fort Union Comedy Company, the whole company came to Las Vegas and performed at the Opera House. So there was it was amazing to me that's because it's pretty far to come by horse and wagon with costumes and all of the stuff and the band came with them. The infantry, the 23rd Infantry Band came with them, and but they did it. I don't know why, but they did. And I got lost in my answer though. Oh, and so Las Vegas was thriving at that time. It had a huge interaction with the fort monetarily. It supplied the fort with flour, along with mora, which is not really featured in the book. It may be mentioned. I don't remember if it's featured in the book though. But there were flour mills all those flour mills fed the fort, and in fact, a large part of the economy of Las Vegas was from the fort.
Sure.
In the book, I refer to it as Las Vegas Grandes. I don't know why, it just sounded better to me. They just say Las Vegas, because really at that point, the whole name would have been used, and I didn't want to use the whole name, you know. And don't ask me what it was.
Kathleen, Kathleen has a question.
Oh, did I answer, John? Did you? What
Yes,
was it?
yes.
Okay.
No, that was a very satisfactory answer. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, Kathleen.
Hi.
Kathleen Harris.
My question deals with Olivia. Now, was
Ah.
she completely made up, or is she a character that you took from maybe someone you knew or a relative, perhaps?
Olivia demanded to become part of the book. She was in the beginning. Mary Margaret needed someone to talk to about the clues and the information. She was barely literate. And so she was very insecure about her interpreting things for herself. She had to talk to the doctor. She had to insist on an autopsy. And I mean, I think it was an autopsy. And she had to do these things. So she needed a helper in my mind. As I was writing the story, I thought, well, okay. And this, the post trader, Mr. Foote, is married to Olivia Foote. And she's, and so she just became, I thought, well, okay, she can be a friend and she can help Mary Margaret and she can teach her whatever she needs to know, or she can interpret things for her. Well, then I started relating to Mary Margaret, to Olivia. And I started giving her qualities I wish I had, or I wanted, or I think that she developed herself in some ways. That's kind of like one of those crazy mystical things writers tell you, but it happens. I can't deny it. Olivia was one of those things that just came in, and she was just, she wouldn't go away.
Yeah.
No, she's not based on anyone I knew or anyone I found in research or anything.
So sort of a Pygmalion made out of clay that you developed into this.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah, I liked her.
And it was easier for me to write Olivia than it was for me to write Mary Margaret, because Mary Margaret is so strong and so committed to finding out who killed Sean. Oops, that's kind of a giveaway thing. Sorry, people, but she is so. And I was never that strong myself, so it was hard for me to put that in. So I had to, I guess, channel is the word. I don't, I'm not really woo-woo, but I had to channel my grandmother, my great-grandmother, Mary Judge, who came from Ireland. And I didn't know her. She died before I was born. So I put all those qualities that I think my great-grandmother had, because actually she was sent as a child to Scotland to work in the mines. And then she came to America from Scotland. So she was like 12 or 13 years old when she got here. And those were real things. That I knew. I didn't have to research them. It was in the family lore, I guess you would call that. And so she became Mary Margaret. So she made.
And Olivia's a nice foil. To me.
I thought. Thank you.
To Mary Margaret. Mary Margaret to me with more no nonsense.
Yes.
Well, because of what she had to deal with too, and what she had to do to be there. My background too. My mother was a McCarthy, and my great aunts came from Ireland. Same thing. Hardworking. Went into agriculture. The men that they married, that sort of thing. And that struck me. That's why I associated with Mary Margaret. But then Olivia was such, there was a gentility about her too.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was a nice play. It worked out.
Thank
well.
you. Thanks.
Are there other, excuse me, are there other questions?
Or comments? Does anyone have something they want to say about either the book or their own books? Oh, hi, Patty Getch. I didn't see you sneak in.
Hi, I'm sorry I'm late. I'm sorry I came to this late.
We're just glad you're here, girl.
Well, I think it's going to
just
be on
got
YouTube.
home. Oh, good.
So Patty, my observation is that number one, I like the book very much. I wrote a review about it and posted it on my website when it came out.
Yes, thank you.
I think what I've appreciated about it is that these two women who were so completely different found each other in a place that just, I mean, there's a line in the book about the winds and their impact on people. And this, to me, this coming together of these very, very diverse characters and how they strengthened each other. I thought that was really a pretty amazing theme of the book.
Well, that's great. I'm really happy that that comes across like that. I felt that way about it. And but you're never quite sure as a writer unless you get to do this with people and talk about the book and get their feelings about it. It's really exciting. And I'm glad you got that feeling. I hoped it was there.
Well,
Are there other?
Patty, I'm so sorry, but I don't know this book yet. I haven't read this book. What is the name of it?
I'll hold it up. It's Prairie
because I
Madness.
got in late. Oh no, I did.
You
Oh,
did.
of course I read
think you're-
Prairie Madness. It was wonderful. Yes, I did. Absolutely. I'm sorry. It's been a while because I think I read it when it first came out.
Yeah,
So
that was
absolutely. Okay, now it's coming back. Oh yes, wonderful. It was a great read.
Thank you.
I'm so I apologize. It's been a while since I've read it. So, but I recommended it a lot.
Well, thanks. I'm grateful. Mary, yes.
Okay, yes, I just want to say I really enjoyed your book so much, Patty. And just the way you made that whole Fort Union come alive. I mean, we had visited Fort Union before, and it's just you just made that whole thing live again. And with all your characters, I mean, I it's very impressive. And the way you talked about your research, I have never been inspired to be a historical fiction writer. It's like, wow, that sounds like fun. I've always enjoyed historical fiction for that very reason, that you can read about a period of time and it just makes it come alive if there are characters living out that period of time. And so I really appreciated that book. And I hope it gets a bigger audience because, especially in New Mexico, everybody is familiar who lives in New Mexico, the area, the aridness of it, the kind of tough living, and all the amazing history of New Mexico. So it just took that little piece of it and just gave it a spark. I thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm so glad I'm so glad that came across because while I was researching, I would get more information than I thought I wanted. And some of it, and a lot of it was descriptive. Describing the fort at that point, you could look at some pictures, but you had to read a lot of description. And so I put that out through the doctor's letters, some of the description. I was trying to not like do an info dump. So, I'm so glad that it does, the description lives and really works.
I
So
think
that's great to hear. Thank you.
I think he has another comment or question.
Did
Kathy,
you say
your hand is up.
Thank you.
who's?
Mine.
Oh,
Definitely.
Kathy.
I have a question. Are you working on another historical novel, or are you going to do a sequel to this one?
Well, it's funny you should ask. Of course, there's always a sequel possible, isn't there?
Yeah.
Because at the end of well, I better not say that for people who haven't read it, but it ends on a note, on a kind of unfinished business
Right.
between Mary and Olivia together. And the Hosses, I don't know, nobody's mentioned the Hosses, but the Hosses, I found them to be really kind of a pivotal thing in there. You know, the one horse that was like, you know, not easy to ride, and then the Pinto that nobody, oh, they don't like Pintos, but Sean rides a Pinto, and all of those things about the Hosses I found really endearing to me. And yes, at the end of the book, I did leave some things hanging that I felt I was possibly going to want to write, because they move into Las Vegas for one thing, for all the different things that happen, but they are leaving the fort at the end.
Yeah.
And
Well,
so,
if you need any encouragement, I think you should do a sequel.
well, thank you.
Yeah.
I have one in mind, and
I
I
wanted
have,
more.
you want more.
There's the blue colors and it says, and I was kind of like, okay, maybe she's going to do a sequel, you know. And
All right, then you got it. I'm going to write it. If I live
excellent.
long enough.
That's all.
And if I don't, you're going to have to pick it up, Kathy, and you'll have
Yeah.
to finish it.
Are there other comments or questions?
Oh, we're just about out of time, aren't we?
Well, we're good.
Because I think I had a question here from
This was,
Mary.
this
Wasn't
is,
there a question from you, Mary Hensler?
she's not, you're mute, you're
You're muted.
here.
I thought I had a question.
Well,
Mary Hensler?
so just while we're waiting for Mary to find her question, this was billed as a workshop sort of about historical fiction writing. Would any of you like to comment on what you might have gained from this that you didn't know before, or it maybe might have encouraged you in some way to write something? I'll have to say, I don't write historical fiction, partly because I'm always afraid of getting the facts wrong. And like Patty said, it's not nonfiction, it's you can use a lot
Right.
of license, but it's very difficult. But I write imaginative fiction or
Yes.
science fiction. And so, but you still have to do research, because if you write something that is so far off the wall, people won't believe you, and it makes the
Yeah.
whole believable. So that kind of inspires me to go back and rethink about some of the books that I would be sequels to some of the other books that I've already written. But it takes connecting those pieces when you start working on a sequel.
Yes. Yeah.
I've only written one piece of historical fiction, and it was a play. But listening to you about the research, I feel the same way about research. And I kind of would like to maybe turn that play into a book, which will require a lot more research than I had to do for a play. So, thank you.
Well, I'll tell you, once you get the bug, it sticks with you, and you just, in fact, I came across something recently. I'm reading this, I'm reading a couple of memoirs because I'm flirting with the memoir idea as well. And this Siri, I don't know, Hustvedt. Have you heard of her? Siri, Siri, and her last name is Hustvedt. And she made a statement in her book, and she said, every story carries inside of itself multitudes of other stories. And I thought, oh my God, that's the research experience. You find a story, and it's not just the story itself, but all these other stories that can be built, and they kind of go off in all these different directions, and you have to pull them back and say, no, you're going to be in this book with me. But they're there, and you can't, the more research you do, the more stories you find. So, and I do feel that, I mean, this is historical fiction we're talking about, Sharon, and that's the bottom line. It's still fiction.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And there's still a lot of imagination possible within the and working with and through the research.
Okay. Anything
Well,
else?
I just want to say thank you, because we had a real salon meeting. This was a salon. We had, everybody took part. Everybody had something to say. Oh, everybody listened and cared. And I really appreciate having you all here. And it was, and I'll read something real quickly from the book. Do I have time?
Yes, ma'am.
I'll read you a little bit from the prologue.
Okay.
This is the prologue, of course, the beginning. It says prologue, in which a body is found. Classic crime novel beginning, okay? Thursday, April 14th, 1881. Clutching the cedar box, slightly smaller than a mailing packet, Porfirio Gonzalez stood behind the counter of his mercantile store and watched Sergeant Sean Flannery swing his crooked leg over the back of his Pinto mare. Gonzalez smiled and fingered the padlock as he recalled that most of the American soldiers disparaged the paint horses. Flannery settled into the saddle, stroked the horse's neck, gently urged her forward. Gonzalez did not imagine that this would be the last time he would watch this familiar event unfold. He stared aimlessly at the horse and rider as the horse and rider jogged away beneath the mottled shade of the budding cottonwood trees, thrashing and twisting in the wind. When Gonzalez was building his store, a two-room adobe rectangle with a pitched roof, he had envisioned a thriving village, bustling with children, family, and neighbors. A good place to settle, he had told his wife. And so she, Ninfa, put names to the places. Los Alamitos for the village, which was no more than a wide, flat meadow at the base of the foothills. One day she pointed to a stand of pine trees. La Casa del Sol, she said, will be our home. But there are no children. There are no families at Los Alamitos. There are a few scattered buildings, the crumbling foundation of a house not built, a fence unfinished, the small squat store, and in a clearing scattered with cottonwood saplings at the base of the foothills, the grave. Sometimes when the wind is right and the shadows long, there is Ninfa, a spirit wandering among the whispering pines, caught for a moment in silhouette at the top of the ridge, her skirts billowing. Porfirio turned and, holding Sean Flannery's box under his arm, disappeared under the curtain and entered the back room, his casita. Because there was but one small window high on the east wall, the space was dim from noon to sunset and remained cool during the heat of the day. The room was sparsely furnished with a narrow cot, a chest of drawers, a small round table, two wooden chairs, and a turquoise blue trastero that Ninfa painted and trimmed with rosebuds. A woven blanket lay on the hard-packed dirt floor, and unlike the store, the room was neat and clean of the relentless prairie dust. Against the south wall, above the iron cook stove, hung an ornately framed photograph of a wedding couple. The woman wears a long lacy dress and a gossamer veil that floats around her like a cloud. Porfirio had worn his only suit that day in a freshly laundered white shirt buttoned to the top. After sliding the box into a small nicho carved into the adobe behind the photograph, Gonzalez returned to the store and took up his place behind the counter.
A lot of foreshadowing there.
Thank you all. Thank you all so much.
I want to thank everyone
Thank you.
for coming.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Patty, for a good presentation and all for the good for all the good questions. Very quickly, I just wanted to say a little bit about the literary salon. We have been around for 2 years. We have featured more than 40 writers in different venues, either in featured writer segments or in presentations. We did a lit salon that involved young writers doing their poetry. So we published a book called Tapestry Essays. Come on, help. And we've published a book, a collection of stories and poems, and some fiction, some nonfiction. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, John Crane, who was one of the winners of the Elmer Schooley contest, has a piece in there it is, and Tapestry. I have several pieces in there. Kathleen has something in there, I believe. David Rogers and David Pascali, Bob. Who else? Well, there are other, Mary Rose, who is also one of the winners of our Elmer Schooley contest. So we've been doing a lot of stuff, and we need, one thing that we would invite is more active participation from members of the salon to help us get these things done. And upcoming, we have 3 things planned. They are very much in the planning stages, but next month, we're going to have a featured author who has written a historical kind of a guidebook, Pat Halverson. She will be presenting for about about 20 minutes, and that will be followed by, excuse me, I'm losing my voice. That will be followed by open mic, in which writers they can either do poetry or prose. We're hoping for dramatic readings, and they will have 5 to 7 minutes to present whatever it is they want to present. And that will hopefully take place at the new Stella Sandwich Shop that the Burskins have on Bridge Street. In September, we're going to be doing a journal writing and journal making workshop. Hopefully, we'll be working with one of the artists here in town that has a gallery, but we haven't confirmed that yet. So I don't want to speak about that until we have it confirmed. And then in October, we're hoping to do this absolutely amazing fundraiser. And it's really not about the money, it's about the fun we're going to have. And David Rogers is working on that. So stay tuned, and we will let you know what's happening next. And we want to invite you to become actively involved in the salon and help us build this idea and make it give it a solid foundation into the future, because this is something that we all believe in. It's not just about writing, it's not just about reading, it's about the arts in general and how we can support one another. So thank you for coming. If you have any more questions for Patty, I'm sure she'll be happy to hang around.